Hello and welcome to Hobbit Hot Takes, a queer reread of The Lord of the Rings. In this episode, we get started with the reading with the prologue. But before that, I have a few general notes, a bit about The Lord of the Rings in general, and my first queer take. Standard disclaimer that this is based on my personal interpretations and opinions, and sometimes headcanons. And if a queer Lord of the Rings is not something you want to see, you can stop watching. If it is, welcome! I'm so glad you're here. And I really appreciate any feedback, thoughts, comments, or questions. I assume that if you are watching these videos, you're familiar with The Lord of the Rings, and I think this series will work best if you're reading along with me. But if you're not, and if you have, for example, only seen the movies or you've read the book once a long time ago, I will be trying to make this accessible for those people as well. If the idea of reading this huge book as a physical book seems daunting, there are several audiobooks out there. There's an official one, and there are several fan-made ones that can be found on the internet. The Lord of the Rings was published in 1954 and 1955. Tolkien wanted it to be just one volume, which did eventually happen, but originally it was published in 3 volumes, the 3 parts of the trilogy that I'm sure we all know. But in addition to being both 1 book and 3 books, The Lord of the Rings is also divided into 6 books. Each of the 3 volumes is divided into 2 books, and they are numbered throughout the trilogy from 1 to 6. I hope that this will not be a source of confusion, but I will try to differentiate which concept I'm talking about. If I'm talking about the whole thing, I'll be talking about the book, the novel, or possibly the trilogy. If I'm talking about the 3 volumes, I'll call them volumes or parts, or by their names. And if I'm talking about one of the 6 books, I'll be calling them by their number. So book 1, book 5, and so on. We'll always refer to one of the 6. Like a lot of fantasy literature, The Lord of the Rings uses the term race to describe the different species of, for example, humans, elves, and dwarves. I'm a bit uncomfortable with this term, and I also don't think it's the most accurate one to be using. And because I don't want to do myself to a life of air quotes, I will try to mostly use the word species instead, unless it's like a direct quote. Similarly, Tolkien uses the word man or men to refer to the species of humans, and this is obviously sexist bullshit, courtesy of the English language. I will be trying to use humans, both for accuracy and clarity, with the caveat that if it's a direct quote, I will use the word men. But additionally, if it's punny, ironic, or otherwise called for, I will use the word man or men where I see appropriate. For example, men suck. And seeing how it's practically a plot point, I imagine there will be several occasions where I will deem it called for. So The Lord of the Rings was written as a sequel to The Hobbit, but it's also a sequel to The Silmarillion, because even though The Silmarillion was only published after Tolkien's death, he had already begun writing it before even The Hobbit, and he worked on it basically his whole life. Tolkien wanted to write a mythology or mythological history for England, and that was the Silmarillion, or his Legendarium. So when he wrote The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, he already had a world to set those novels in. While The Hobbit is a children's book, originally written to amuse Tolkien's own children, the Silmarillion is a book of mythology. It's very different in style. It's very high and poetic, I guess. And I think The Lord of the Rings is a combination of the two. The Hobbit and the Silmarillion, and it really works. It's got the adventure side and the familiar comforts and quirks of The Hobbit, and also the mythological and poetic side of the Silmarillion. The Lord of the Rings is set during the ending of an era and the beginning of one. It's the ending of the age of mythology and the age of elves, and the beginning of the age of the dominion of men, I should say humans, who will, in Tolkien's world, become us. I think the very important difference between the Silmarillion, which, although published later, is set before The Lord of the Rings, and The Lord of the Rings, is that the Silmarillion is a collection of myths, presumably written down by someone long after the fact, whereas The Lord of the Rings is a description of events that will, in later days, probably become myth, but the way it's written is the perspective towards those events is not that they happened in the distant past, but rather closer. The in-universe story is that The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings are actually, at least it is implied, books written by Bilbo, Frodo and Sam. The setting of The Lord of the Rings, apart from the Shire, is very human-centric, and even though most of our heroes are hobbits, they too, when they leave the Shire and enter the world, it's very much the world of men. Elves and dwarves and ents and wizards are only sort of visitors, or not visitors, but it happens almost entirely in the realm of men. And I think that's very important to note, that this is not a given. This is a choice of perspective, because that's the theme, one of the themes of the, the era that it's set in. So at the time of The Lord of the Rings, most of the really mythological stuff with gods and elves is in the past, and so far in the past that it's become a legend to men. We run into this many times during the novel, and there's this bittersweet tone of nostalgia, at least that's the way I see it, because while to humans it is the beginning of their age, to everyone else it's the age of their fading, their passing, their leaving the world. And even the humans feel some of the melancholy about that the elves are leaving. The hobbits, I'm not sure where to place actually. On the one hand, I count them among these more mythological species with elves and dwarves and ents, but on the other hand, it's suggested that they are a subset of men. The way that they are centered alongside men also suggests that. And the fact that while everyone else is somewhere in the Middle Ages, the Shire seems to be in Victorian England, I guess also suggests that. But the great thing is, I don't need to come to a conclusion. It can be both in different ways. Okay, so I just realized that despite my best intentions, and despite making them explicit beforehand, I keep saying men when I mean the species of humans. I guess that's partly because it's just the word men and man is just used so much in the text that I've assimilated. But because I don't want to just be making mistakes, I will also posit that this may have something to do with how alienated I feel from the species of humans in The Lord of the Rings. Let me show you a TikTok video I made about a year ago. So I'm listening to The Lord of the Rings audiobooks. I'm also listening to the Silmarillion audiobook. For reasons. Anyway, I am becoming convinced that when they talk about men and the kingdom of men and all the mistakes of men and the kind of lame culture of men, also Frodo doesn't trust men, obviously I'm having great fun listening to this. But also, the word man is instrumental in the downfall of one of the big bats. Anyway, long story short, I'm becoming convinced that men means men. No, men means the cis-hets. Everyone else is queer. Elves are queer, hobbits are queer, dwarves are queer. And the thing is, The Lord of the Rings is about the ending of an age and a lost world. And it's the lost world of queers. I guess that was less cohesive than I remembered. But anyway, seeing everyone except the species of humans as some sort of representation of queerness is very compelling to me. As a general topic, I guess this divides opinions very reasonably, because for some queer people, seeing themselves as elves or aliens or computers is very liberating and very validating, whereas for others, it's dehumanizing to see themselves represented as anything other than human, very understandably. I personally will identify with every non-binary computer or alien I see on TV, probably more than the non-binary humans I see represented. But that doesn't mean that I don't understand the other perspective. I think in general it also makes a big difference who is making the analogy. And I guess in this case it's not, obviously, it's not Tolkien presenting these non-human species as queer. It's my interpretation. It's an analogy that wasn't intended by the author, but that presents itself to me from the text, and I guess influences my whole reading. As a queer person living amongst this cis heteronormativity, it's a comforting thought, even if it's just a fantasy, that in some time before time there was a world where cis-hetness was not the norm, but just one faction of many species, if you will. That this is a recent development. That the loss of magic that I feel comes from some loss that happened before our collective memory begins. That there was this lost world of queerness that we are subconsciously longing for. To come back to Tolkien's representation of humans, it's very male. It's very cis-hetero. I guess it just feels lucky that there are these other alternatives, these other species to project onto. Okay, now we can talk about the prologue. I guess the prologue can be a bit boring and dry, but it's also full of charming details. I guess it's not your typical fantasy prologue that usually includes a hooded stranger in a dark alley whose identity you will find out 300 pages later. Tolkien's prologue is a bunch of info dumping about mostly hobbits. I actually just read in Tolkien's letters that a lot of the stuff in the prologue was put there because fans had asked about it, about more details about hobbits and about their tobacco and stuff like that. So the prologue is a bit of a primer to hobbit culture and the history of hobbits and their settlement in the Shire and so on. But it's not all of it is information that you're gonna have to remember, which can be a relief. You will not need to remember the difference between Fellowhides and Stoors. There are also certain things that, if you're reading The Lord of the Rings for the first time, you're not going to know the significance of immediately, such as a reference to two exceptionally tall hobbits, and a quotation from Meriadoc Brandybuck, basically pipeweed scholar, or a certain wizard that enjoyed pipeweed a lot. I think it's rather charming. And also the fact that it's so nerdy, and it also includes these characters that are so nerdy. I mean, Merry and Pippin, you know, especially if you're coming from the films, you know them as these light-hearted troublemakers and possibly later tiny warriors, but they also started the Shire's first libraries and wrote a lot of books. Yeah, I just love all the nerdery. I love the concept of mathem, something that you no longer have use for but are not ready to part with, which the hobbits might keep in their own houses, but might also put into a Matham house, which is a museum. I just like the little detail. Overall, hobbits represent this idealized pastoral English countryside community. They're a simple, happy folk who appreciate peace, familiarity, comfort. They're described as having a close relationship with the earth and not understanding or liking machines more complicated than a forge bellows, a watermill, or a hand loom, though they were skillful with tools. Tolkien himself had a dislike of machines and what he calls in his letters mechanism. And overall, in general, it's pretty obvious the hobbits in the Shire are a reflection of Tolkien's values and ideals, and some sort of nostalgia for an English countryside that may or may not have existed. But Tolkien is a good writer. He's a writer with a lot of nuance. And this idyllic Shire would be quite overkill and quite saccharine if they didn't also have flaws and if there wasn't criticism as well. Hobbits are simple in both the positive and the negative sense. They have a simple lifestyle, simple pleasures, straightforward values, but they're not really forward thinkers. Hobbits are quite insular and disinterested in the world outside and suspicious of it. They're described as sheltered. They're unaware that they are actually being protected from outside their borders. And in addition to this, within their own community, they're suspicious of difference and change. And they have settled into a set of norms that discourages difference. But interestingly, another thing that stood out to me in the prologue was the mention of the Took family, who are the ruling family of the Shire, I guess, essentially nobility or aristocrats or what have you. If you recall, Pippin is a son of a Took. The Thane, who is the highest authority in the Shire, has been a Took for a couple of centuries at the time of the novel. Although, according to the text, the Thaneship had ceased to be more than a nominal dignity, and I guess in more practical terms, the mayor of the Shire is a leader of some sort, or, a mayor. But what's interesting about this is that Tooks are the family that's known for producing these peculiar characters, such as Bilbo. His tendencies to adventure are always blamed on the Took side taking over, rather than the proper and boring Baggins side. And I think it's interesting that this is the ruling family, and maybe it suggests that the hobbits weren't always quite so proper and boring, or that wasn't always their ideal. It does say that these qualities, adventurousness and peculiarity, were now rather tolerated in the rich than generally approved. One more thing that I would take away from the prologue is some implications of recent changes and recent trouble. This is related to us mostly through increased activity at the borders of the Shire. I'll just read you a quote. At the time when this story begins, the Bounders, as they were called, the border patrol people, had been greatly increased. There were many reports and complaints of strange persons and creatures prowling about the borders or over them. The first sign that all was not quite as it should be, and always had been, except in tales and legends of long ago. Few heeded the sign, and not even Bilbo yet had any notion of what it portended. There are actually two things at work here. The Shire has increased its border patrols. Partly, this is telling of the Hobbits' increasing suspicion of the outside world and outsiders and strangers, which is not only related to changes in the world, it's related to their becoming more and more insular. But it is also a sign of the changes that are happening in the times they live in, as Sauron slowly and at first covertly gains more power. I wanted to add that the idea of increased activity at the borders being a portent of evil is potentially problematic. I think we're going to assume here that what this means is there are more of Sauron's spies and other nefarious characters out and about. But considering that we know the hobbits to be somewhat xenophobic, not all of the border activity might be nefarious. And it just occurred to me that some of these suspicious people prowling the borders might actually be the rangers who are protecting the Shire without their knowledge. The time when the story begins, the time of Bilbo's party, is 17 years before Frodo actually leaves the Shire with the ring. So these changes in their environment and the increased restlessness at their borders and outside their borders is not just something that starts happening just before Frodo leaves with the ring. It has been happening for 20 years, maybe more. And I think that highlights how slow the changes are. I mean, The Hobbit happens, 70 years before Frodo leaves the Shire? Something like that. And Bilbo's finding of the ring, or Gollum's losing it, is one of the first signs that something is up and that something's moving in the world, that Sauron is on the move again. And in The Hobbit, Gandalf, with some other wizards, banishes the necromancer from Mirkwood, the necromancer being Sauron. So something has been up for decades. It makes sense that by the time something is noticed in the Shire, it has been going on in the world at large for quite a bit longer. And as the story picks up, and especially after the hobbits leave the Shire, where they have, after all, been quite protected from the changes in the outside world, these changes that have been slow and subtle start to pick up and become more and more obvious and more drastic. We leave a peaceful Shire with some trouble at the borders that nobody knows the significance of, and we arrive in Minas Tirith that is at war. Well, I think that's it for the prologue. Thank you for joining me, and I hope you will be joining me next time for Chapter 1, A Long Expected Party. Again, if you have any feedback, thoughts, comments, questions, leave them below. And see you next time. This has been Hobbit Hot Takes.